Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing sword of destruction and some of the important principles, rules, concepts, theories, and strategies that we can pull out of this technique. So, the ideal attack for this technique is a left roundhouse punch. Okay? So, let's talk through rule number one. Rule number one is called establishing your base. So, why do we want to establish our base? Because we need a firm foundation, which gives us stability. We want to still be able to move, which gives us mobility, and then we also want to be able to have availability, in this case, all four of our weapons, some for offense and some for defense. So now we've got through that concept, let's move on to a new concept called the outer rim. So what is the outer rim? If you'll notice, I established my base, like I said, for rule number one. If you look at what's going on here, we have a zone that we can be hit in. So what we want to be able to do is protect that zone. So we do this thing called an outer rim, and that gives us the area in which we want to protect. That goes from the top of our head or top of our eyebrows out to our shoulders and down to our groin. So if you notice, this is an oval or egg-shaped type of pattern that we're going to be protecting. So everything within that pattern is what we're going to try and protect. So how does this used in defensive purposes? So the way that is, if we look at what's going on here, we want to be able to defend ourselves against that punch. So if you'll notice, I've done this block. There's an idea that's called, with blocking, that's called in order to beat action, meet action. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trying to get to that punch as fast as possible, but there's a problem. If we bring in the concept of this outer rim, we want to stay within that outer rim. We don't want to continue the other concept of beating action by going outside of our outer rim, because why? Because we have this big hole here in which the opponent can then take advantage of. So what we want to make sure that we do is we use that outer rim with this defensive purpose of this extended outward by staying within that outer rim. So this brings in a new concept here of from active to passive blocking. So what does that mean? We've done this active block, but then look at my left hand. If I now face the camera again, if I do not use this left hand, you'll notice that there's another big hole here. Just like going outside this outer rim leaves a big hole, so we want to stay with the side of it so we can use it quickly. We also have the hole of our left hand if we don't use it. So what we want to do is fill that hole with our left hand, and this is called checking. So there's a difference between checking and covering, and that difference would be what's going on. So if we want to talk about the big concept of checking, both checking and covering fall within inside of it. Checking being where I'm actually touching the opponent and preventing things from moving, whereas the covering version is more passive. All I'm doing is positioning my body in such a way, so if I face the camera again, that I cover things up so that they're not available to the opponent, so it deters them from coming at us. So one actually prevents motion and one dissuades motion from being taken. Okay? So now let's bring in a rule that goes in with this blocking. So I'm doing this block, and now I pull in a rule called the plus X rule. If you'll notice what's happening here, this person is punching relatively on a horizontal, and I'm blocking relatively on a vertical. So I bring in this plus X rule. So what's the importance of this plus X rule? Because that brings in the major concept that's being used here, which is called margin for error. So if you notice, I can make changes in this block and still have this block being effective. And this is in a defensive manner. So let's take this idea of margin for error and flip it, show the opposite of that, and let's use it in an offensive manner. So that's what's happening here in the next part of the technique. So once we've got this block, we're going to be doing this kick and this chop. And now we're using what's called an open-ended triangle on their body in order to do an offensive motion or kick or chop them. In this case, if you look at the bottom, we've got it here, and if we look at the top, we've got it here. Potentially out the arm, or if the arm's out of the way, just from the shoulder to the head and into the neck. So how does this fit in the margin for error? Because if I miss, I can then glide up and still hit the point that I need to intend to kick. And it's also useful here up on the top. I can miss the point of the triangle and still make contact with targets that are available to me. So I can make error and still be effective in what I'm doing. So now, let's move on to the strategy of this technique now that we've covered all this stuff. So the idea of this technique is I do this block and I'm ready to go. I've got my cover and everything's all ready to go. But we're in a really bad position. If you look at our zone of action, we are between their four weapons. They still have all four weapons available to them, even though we block this left hand. they still have their left leg, their right leg, and their right hand available to them. And that's important because these are their majors. All they did is throw a minor at us. So what are we trying to do here? So what we're trying to do here is trying to eliminate these majors as much as possible and potentially these minors. So how do we do that? So the strategy of this technique is I do that initial block, I recognize the fact that I'm in a bad position, I kick them in the groin. Why? Because I want them to bend over. Because as we force them to bend over, we remove their availability of their weapons. Remember back to rule number 1, we wanted availability of our weapons, but we also want to have leverage over our opponent, which brings in a new concept of leverage. So I want to maintain my levers and leverage over this opponent if possible, and the way I do that is through this kick. And the way I recognize that is because my zone of action is between their hands or on their center line. So I do that kick, and then I go down into this chop using an open and a triangle. So this brings in the next thing that we want to talk about, or the last thing we want to talk about. So what's happening here with this chop? If you'll notice, we're doing this kick and we're doing this chop, and if you'll notice the position of the elbow, this is extremely important, because as we talk through our power principles, we have gravitational marriage, torque, and backup mass. Okay? So 2 of those fit together. We have backup mass and gravitational marriage, which are the horizontal and vertical version of each other. And there's a saying that goes with backup mass, that alignment makes backup mass possible. Therefore, alignment also makes gravitational marriage possible. And how does that work with this concept of anchored elbow? Well, if you'll notice that if I chop this way, 2 things are wrong. One is the alignment, because if you'll notice, the hand is all isolated by itself and it's not being backed up by the body. So anchoring that elbow, if you'll notice, draws an alignment so that our body can then be used to enhance this chop. The next thing, if you'll notice that we did with our left hand, taking it back to the beginning of this and covering, if you'll notice, why did we do this? Because we wanted to cover up these exposed targets. So if I don't do this, you'll notice there's a big hole here, which then leaves areas and targets in which they can hit. And by anchoring that elbow, it covers those targets and then leaves the left hand to go lower if it needs to cover the really low targets. So we need that alignment for both covering and to make the gravitational marriage possible. So now that we've done all that, let's go back and demonstrate the technique very quickly for you so that you can see it being executed. Up. Hope this video helps you understand American Kenpo a little better. Thank you very much.